We're talking tonight, the 12th lecture, not the final one, but the 12th one, called American Jewry, Orthodox Spring, Conservative Summer, Traditionalist Autumn, and Secularist Winter. I must have been in a meteorological mood when I wrote that up. But it does express an idea that I want to bring out. And remember, we're focusing on a specific time over here, late 40s, early 50s, 49, 52, 48 to 52, which are very interesting years. I mean, anything's interesting, but very interesting years in terms of transformations that do and do not happen in American Jewry. So tonight, for the first time in this series, really, I'm directing the focus away from Israel, the state of Israel, what's happening in there, to the largest Jewish community, because Israel is much smaller in the beginning, obviously. Only very recently has, numerically, Israeli Jewry overtaken American Jewry, which is really a marker in Jewish history. You understand? They're still not as rich as we are, but the numbers are there, and hopefully the numbers go up with them. And that was a great dream of the original Zionists who wanted to normalize the Jewish condition, which they defined as the idea that most Irishmen live in Ireland, most Frenchmen live in France. Right? Most Germans live in Germany. There are some that live elsewhere. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of Irishmen that live outside of Ireland. And there are a lot of Chinese that live outside of China. But most Chinese live in China. And therefore, most Jews should live in Israel. I mean, that was a basic notion of what they defined as normalcy 100 years ago. But in the period we're talking about, which is post-war, American Jewry is without question the most important Jewish community, particularly in the wake of the Holocaust after World War II. In simple language, they killed all the Jews in Europe. They certainly killed out, and I mean killed out, the seedbed of what had been traditionally for many, many centuries the demographic heartland, and certainly the cultural heartland of the Jewish people around the world. I've hammered home the point many times in the past that there were far more than 50% of the Jews of the world concentrated in Eastern Europe. You hear what I said, the majority of Jews of the world were concentrated in Eastern Europe. So that's quantitatively, and I think it's not even a question that qualitatively, in terms of Jewish culture of one kind or another, Eastern Europe, and I'm using that term broadly, but nevertheless, clearly, was the headquarters of the Jewish people for whatever kind of movement you're talking about in the last 500 years. Whether it's a religious movement on the one hand, for example, the Litvaks and the Hasidim, to take one obvious example, or whether you're talking, or we're talking about a heretical movement like the Sabbateans or something like that, or whether you're talking about a modernist movement such as the Haskalah and socialism and Bundism and communism and all the other isms, Yiddishism and so forth, all of them got their traction and their origins actually in Eastern Europe. And just to compare the cultural richness of Jewish life, religious or not religious, with the lack of it in America today, in which we live in a Jewish cultural wasteland, except for a few. But the broad masses of American Jewry is illiteracy beyond precedent in the history of our people, cultural literacy, and Hebrew literacy. Forget the religious side. Is unprecedented. So all this got wiped out in the World War II, so we're what's left. And the American Jews are 4 or 5 million by this time, and as I say before, without question, it's the most important and the largest Jewish community in the world. I would also say, by the way, the most, as far as I know, historically, the most generous Jewish community in Jewish history. We don't have the exact numbers of how much money they used to give out 1,000 years ago, but as much as we can tell, there's never been, it's just good to know, there's never been a Jewish community which shelled out so much money to other communities. I'm not talking about what they spend in America. To other communities around the world, the way the American Jewish community has done so in the 19th and 20th century. Numerically, the numbers tell the whole story. 8,000 Jews in America in 1830, 250,000 in 1880, 2.5 million in 1914, 4 million during World War II. So through immigration and through natural increase, numerically, the American Jews shoot up. Now, that ends with World War II. It's 5 million Jews then, it's 5 million Jews today, roughly speaking. 5.5, whatever. Zero population growth. Okay? But until then, it wasn't that way. Obviously, American Jewry is physically untouched by the terrible 20th century. Say to all the people here whose parents moved here before 1914, go to the cemetery and say thank you. You know, he ducked a lot of bullets. In contrast, obviously, to the Eastern European heartland, which was exterminated. But American Jewry is, even by the time of World War II, culturally ravaged by the open and liberal American culture and environment. This is the great failing of American Jewry, historically speaking, although there are excellent conditions present for the creating a vibrant and vigorous Jewish culture all its own, it does not do so. Why? This is a very deep question. A religious Jew would answer that any attempt to create a vibrant and vigorous Jewish culture divorced from fundamentalism is inherently doomed. That's a very frum point of view. Right? You're not going to make any kind of Judaism work if it's not based on God and the Torah, all the rest of it. Good luck, try. But that's a religious point of view. A Jew who's not religious would obviously not subscribe to this analysis. Instead, he would assign blame for the massive Judaic ignorance of American Jewry on the Philistinism, those in the cultural the vapidity of the American Jewish elites, who ultimately only respect money and not culture. Such a gap between wealth and cultural knowledge has never existed in pre-modern Jewish history. Interesting. You had in Europe and other places, always had rich and poor, but traditionally speaking, the wealthy had some sort of level of Jewish knowledge and sensitivity for the cultivation of Jewish knowledge. When you get to America in the 20th century, and as time goes on, you have more and more in which the wealth is concentrated in people that know nothing and don't even care the fact they know nothing, and will turn, to use a Baltimore metaphor, they'll turn a Hebrew college into a parking lot or something like that, and literally, and it doesn't mean anything to them. You get it? No, they're so out of it. This you never had, as far as I'm aware, before in Jewish history. The elites sort of call the shots. In simple English, rich American Jews are not interested in bankrolling a network of schools which offered intensive Jewish education, offering intensive knowledge of classic Jewish literature, a necessary, though not sufficient, condition for the creation of a vibrant Jewish culture and civilization in America. If you don't have masses of American Jews out there that know anything about Jews, can read Hebrew to some degree, have Jewish books in their house, whatever you want to define it as. If all this is totally foreign, then don't expect anything other than a cultural wasteland. Instead, American Jewry, already by then, and certainly since then, is characterized by an intensive cultural Judaic vapidity, which pervaded all sectors of American Jewry, from the Talmud Torahs and the synagogue religious schools, to the teachers' colleges and the rabbinical seminaries, to the Jewish media, the press, the newspapers, the weeklies, and the magazines, which still wallow in ignorance and vapidity in the year 2013. To the Yiddish stage, to American Jewish literature, to theology and philosophy, the level of ignorance of Jewish stuff there is just amazing. It's a great moment of failure, and yet it was not seen that way. Because externally, American Jewry was the largest, freest, and most politically powerful Jewry in history. I repeat, the most politically powerful Jewry in history. To be honest, who has protected whom? Has Israel protected American Jewry? Or has American Jewry protected Israel, even today? Right? What gives Israel its power? Now, I'm not saying it's good, right? I don't want that yet. Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do. You understand what I'm saying? This picture says, as Blaustein, why did Ben Gurion give in to him? Who needed whom? Who had the money? Who had the influence with Truman? Who needed whom? This guy had a nice house in Baltimore, doesn't need anybody. You get it? Actually, it's a place near Israel, isn't it? You understand what I'm saying? And the dirty fact is, most of the countries today, or many of the countries today, that maintain, especially third world countries, that maintain diplomatic relations with Israel, don't do so because of Israel. They do so because they want to get help from the Congress, and they find out that if you want to get anywhere in Congress, you got to go along with the Jewish lobby. So the Africans say this all the time. And so that's sort of standing classic Zionism on its head. Because it's supposed to be that Israel is protecting the other communities. But it didn't quite work out that way. Now to our topic tonight. I will discuss American Jewry in 1949-52 in terms of 5 groups: secular, Reform, Conservative, Traditionalist, and Orthodox. Secular Judaism, as defined in those days I'm talking about, were all the ists, as I said before. The Yiddishists, the Bundists, the communists, the socialists, ideological Zionists, the Hebraists, the Maskilim, and others. This was a group, if you went back literally 100 years ago to the year 1913, would be very vibrant and often very influential people within the context of American Jewry. What is the biggest Jewish building in America 100 years ago? And the answer is the Forward in Lower East Side. I mean, which tells you something. And center of a tremendously vibrant culture. They had stuff going on there all the time. And similar institutions all across the United States. You had very committed and passionate people involved in all these sorts of things. By the time you get to 1945, 1950, they're old. And they're getting older. And their kids aren't interested. It turns out to be a one-generation phenomenon. The parents or the grandparents or whatever you want to call it are Yiddishists, not the kids. The kids go to college. The kids are normal. The kids become a doctor and a lawyer. They go to the University of Maryland, they go to Hopkins, they go wherever. They don't do that stuff. The children of the Yiddishists and the Hebraists are speaking English. Thank you very much. They have Americanized, and they look at the old stuff. By the time I'm talking about 1949, 1950, and all the rest of it, they look at the old stuff as provincial and backwards. The children of the communists, socialists, and Bundists, by the period I'm talking about, are professionals. And more importantly, bourgeois, members of the most successful middle-class society in history. You talk about the United States of America after World War II, economy shoots up, living standards shoots up. As doctors, lawyers, accountants, teachers, and most important, businessmen, in other words, employers, the structural economic imbalances that led to the exploitation of their parents' generation of Jewish tailors and dressmakers no longer directly affects them. You kind of look at life different when you're a small businessman now and you're employing others than you did, than your parents did when they were employed by others. The terrible working conditions that exist in the industrial sectors, all the rest. Well, if you're living in Scarsdale, doesn't quite have the same immediacy. And this is a phenomenon that not only in New York, but sweeps all across the United States. It's a generational, especially post-World War II, sociological and economic shift, which is nothing wrong with it, but obviously is going to radically affect your interests and your point of view and your passions or lack of passions compared to those of your parents. Then there's the tide of the American culture, which pervades the economic psychology of the masses. Even workers in the United States identify themselves as members of the middle class, which is really a great crime in Marxism. The number one rule in Marxism is you have to have a class consciousness, and that the most advanced element of society is the proletariat, the workers. But if American culture is so constituted that the workers actually consider themselves not yet employers, but one day will be. I'm temporarily a worker, but not always. You don't see yourself as perpetually members of a certain class in society, which is going to become the dictators, as they say, dictatorship of the proletariat, all the rest of it. But rather, you just see this as a kind of transitional phase. You're committing the number one crime of lack of proper class consciousness, which is up there in the Ten Commandments of what not to do within Marxism. By the way, Abraham Lincoln, if you know, gave a speech, I think in the 1850s, in which he asked the question at that time in the United States, why are there no labor unions, which there weren't in his time? And he says, because everybody figures tomorrow I'm going to be employer. I'm not interested in the minimum wage. You understand? That's just a temporary thing for me now. But when I get to be where I want to be, I don't want the minimum wage. When you have that kind of business, it's not going to be conducive to the perpetuation of a subculture of Yiddish-speaking or Jewishly members, the people of Marxist kind of groups, the way that it existed and flourished prior to the Second World War. The Yiddish theater is getting older and more sparsely attended. None of those once lively phenomena seem relevant in post-war America. As the 50s and 60s go on, the decadent trends that I'm describing will simply accelerate. Many of us have lived through this in our own lives. Instead of constructing an alternative Judaism or Jewish culture, the younger generation, by the late 40s and 50s, will just be secular American with no Judaism at all. It'll be secular, in other words, but it won't be secular Jewish. They will participate in culture, but it will not be Jewish culture. On the contrary, they'll play a seminal role as we all know, in the development of American culture, which is a lot more interesting. You have a lot more readers. Many of them, by the way, will end up in the 50s and 60s in liberal politics. They will staff things like the JFK administration, the LBJ administration, and many other issues like that. If you look at the personal biographies of all these guys, they're one generation away from the Lower East Side or the Bronx, wherever the parents were members of socialist or similar types of cultural profiles. And the children went to college, but they carried their parents' passion and translated into fights, let's say, for example, for civil rights or something along those lines. But none of this will have any Judaic real content to it. So that's for secular Judaism. Reform Judaism during this era had to detach itself from its 19th century ideology, particularly its anti-Zionism and its very strong anti-traditionalism. It needs to do so in order to expand beyond its German Jewish base and attract the Eastern European Jews. In other words, 250,000 German Jews came to this country in the 1800s. 250,000. The vast majority of them ended up by the year 1900 in reform. That's what happened, to the degree that anybody was interested in religion whatsoever. Okay? Overwhelmingly across the United States in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, one Orthodox shul after the other flipped and went reform. That's the history of America in the 19th century. Shine. So that's a constituency of 250,000, roughly speaking. But then come another 2.5 million, and then another million after that from Eastern Europe. In the beginning, the Reform don't even want them in the temple. But after a while, you do. Especially by the time you get to the late 30s and after the Second World War, these people are not Yiddish-speaking schleppers anymore, but they're the doctors and the lawyers and the businessmen that are up and coming. In order to do that, these type of people may not be particularly frum, but they don't understand the shul, which is their yarmulke. You understand? Where they'll throw you out for wearing a hat. They don't understand what's wrong, as classic reform was against bar mitzvah. They don't understand what's wrong with Hanukkah and with all these other cultural landmarks of classical Reform Judaism. And most importantly, in the 1940s and the early 50s, they ain't got no time for an anti-Zionist Reform Judaism, which is in principle opposed to establishment of a Jewish state because it will call into question the dual loyalty of the American Jews. People say, to heck with that. They got a Hitler to make a Holocaust over here. We've got to make a state of Israel. And so, as I say, Reform Judaism has to sort of detach itself from the old days. They have to bring in Zionism and bar mitzvahs and Ivrit and Talaisim even, but no changes in theology. Okay? That they won't do. No changes in theology. But interestingly, Reform Judaism, and here they represented a lot of people, interpreted, listen closely what I'm about to say, they interpreted World War II as a crusade for liberalism. You understand? A war for literally a liberal rule of the world. All the problems, Hitler, they interpreted it as being part of a particular type of staunch conservatism and had to be eradicated from the world in order to create a liberal and I guess you'd say today a multicultural, new and ideal world, which kind of messianic its implications. This is a particular point of view in the post-war period, disseminated by a liberal intelligentsia. The writers, the movie makers, always fascinating movies as expression of culture. Take a look at the point at what I'm about to show you from the famous movie Battleground of 1949 with Van Johnson and all the other guys. But wait a second, this is a Hollywood written. In other words, somebody wrote the script. And what the guy's going to emphasize is, you guys went to fight in World War II to eradicate fascism. Before we even show that, let me say this. Most people in America, if you know the history, whose kids went off to war, they were not out to send their children to get killed. An Iowa farmer, a worker in Chicago or something like that, to eradicate fascism from the world. As a matter of fact, most of them were more scared about communism than they were about fascism. They did it because America was attacked at Pearl Harbor. And they weren't too crazy about the whole thing altogether. But that's not the narrative that Hollywood and the liberal elites wish to purvey in the post-war period. Instead, they want to do this, as Eisenhower wrote in his famous memoir, this was a crusade for freedom. The average person, including you, was like this: the heck with crusade for freedom. I don't want my kid to get killed so the Dutch can get their freedom. I'm willing to put my kid on the line and necessarily get killed if it's to protect America from being invaded. But not to go and save all these other people over there. After all, they wouldn't come to help me either. Everybody to his own. But that's not the narrative. And that will not become the accepted narrative in the 25 years after the end of World War II. Take a look at this. This is supposed to be this is a dramatization taking place during the Battle of the Bulge. Vintage American post-war movie.
Anybody here from Ohio? Buckeye Lake, sir? Cincinnati, sir. Naval Heights, sir. Tippecanoe City.
He's a chaplain.
I'm from Chillicothe. Any of you men Lutherans? Here, sir. Here, sir. I am, sir. My wife is, sir. So am I. But these services aren't just for Lutherans any more than they're just for men from Ohio. I merely happen to be in your area. In other areas are other chaplains of various denominations and religions. All of us Holy Joes are switch hitters. Earlier this month in Holland, I held Hanukkah services for some of the men of the Jewish faith. How'd I do, Levenstein? Not bad for a beginner, sir. Well, now it's nearly Christmas. And here we are in beautiful Bastogne enjoying the winter sports. And the $64 question is, was this trip necessary? I'll try to answer that. But my sermons, like everything else in the Army, depend on the situation and the terrain. So I assure you this is going to be a quickie. Was this trip necessary? Well, let's look at the facts. Nobody wanted this war but the Nazis. A great many people tried to deal with them, and a lot of them are dead. Millions have died for no other reason except that the Nazis wanted them dead. So, in the final showdown, there was nothing left to do except fight. There's a great lesson in this. And those of us who've learned it the hard way aren't going to forget it. We must never again let any force dedicated to a super race, or a super idea, or a super anything, become strong enough to impose itself upon a free world. We must be smart enough and tough enough in the beginning to put out the fire before it starts spreading. So my answer to the $64 question is, yes, this trip was necessary. As the years go by, a lot of people are going to forget, but you won't. And don't ever let anybody tell you you were a sucker to fight in the war against fascism. And now, Jerry permitting, let us pray. Let's pray for this fog to lift. Almighty God, the organist is hitting those bass notes a little too loud for me to be heard. So let us each pray in his own way, to his own God.
That's a classical cultural, hello? Yeah, that's a classical cultural statement. Let me assure you right now, no Christian chaplain did any Hanukkah services in World War II, but it sounds good, right? And the idea of ecumenism and that everybody should be all together, and if you know, there's even a little bit of Cold War business in there where they don't let any other groups come to get powerful in there. I mention this because this is the elite point of view, this elite worldview, and this is the one embraced by Reform Judaism, and I'm saying it for a reason, because it's going to characterize where they're going to go after the end of World War II, which is a super liberal politics direction. Okay? As I told you, it's not actually true, but it was a cultural reading of the times by the liberal elites. It's a reading that results in the relegation of anti-Semitism and discrimination to beyond the pale by the WASP elites. And that did happen. Meaning, in the years we're talking about, it just became unacceptable to be anti-Semitic openly, and that there's something wrong with you if you have any kind of feelings of prejudice whatsoever, even though everybody has feelings of prejudice somewhere or another. But you can't say it, meaning it becomes, as we say today, politically incorrect. Again, the iconic cultural representation of this message is, of course, the famous movie that comes out once again in 1947, Gentleman's Agreement, in which, for the first time, Hollywood will have a whole movie about anti-Semitism, which, of course, is treated as a disease, you see, and something absolutely horrible. Here's, again, a classic and famous, clip, which is shown all across the United States to big audiences during this period, and is sending out very definite messages of, now that the war's over, we have to go in a new direction. Gregory Peck, of course, is a reporter pretending to be Jewish, so he can write a story. That's Gregory Peck.
They decided to turn him away.
I have a reservation. Double room and bath, day through Thursday.
In what name, please?
Green, Philip Green.
Yes, Mr. Green. How do you do, Mr. Green?
How do you do?
In answer to your question, may I inquire, are you, do you follow the Hebrew religion yourself?
And there seems to be some mistake because we don't have a free room in the entire hotel.
But if you'd like, perhaps I can fix you over at the Brewster Hotel down near the station.
I'm not staying at the Brewster. Look, I'm Jewish and you don't take Jews. That's it, isn't it?
I never said that.
If you don't accept Jews, say so.
Don't raise your voice to me, Mr. Green. Speak a little more quietly, please.
Okay. Again, this is something that couldn't be imagined in Hollywood before the Second World War. This is the cultural universe of Reform Judaism, and indeed the next 30 years will be the peak years of American liberalism. A strong conservatism actually will be beyond the pale. Look at this guy. Right? Oh no, that's unacceptable. And so the Cold War, by the way, this is very important, will also accelerate the rise of liberalism. In fact, 20th century liberalism in general is really, though unacknowledgedly, due to the influence or the threat of Karl Marx. The United States and most of the Western countries were economically, as well as socially, ideologically, very conservative prior to the 20th century. And that's the way they wanted to be. But the rise of Marxism made all the elites across the West, including the United States, afraid, oh, if we don't give the workers more and more concessions, or these other racial groups or things that concessions, then they'll go communist, and they'll try to wreck the whole thing. And so as a result of this, all across the West, and that's the reason it happened, whatever they tell you, they thought it's the better part of valor to yield here and yield there and yield in the other place in order to avoid some kind of communist revolution taking over, in which the masses just storm everything and wreck it. And so this is characteristic of this period. The power of the labor unions in America and elsewhere was a function of the fear of the Reds. They figured you better yield to the labor unions, even though big business didn't want to do that, because they'll be taken over by more left-wing types. And next thing you know, you'll have real communists trying to seize the factories and things of this nature. For Reform Judaism in these years, civil rights and other social justice causes will therefore be defined as the Iker of Judaism. The Jewish side will be the tuffle, will be the lesser important one. Sounds funny to say, but it's not. I mean, this is what they say in their own literature. In the years 45, 55, 65, 75, until around then, what is Judaism? The Judaism is the struggle for civil rights. Oh yes, you also have the temple side and the rituals and all the rest of it, but they're far less important than working to change American society, which they do effectuate together with other liberal groups. On the other hand, the years 49 and 52 will be the golden age of conservative Judaism. Again, the 25 years after the Second World War are the golden age of conservative movement. It's their moment. Hundreds of Orthodox shuls all across America will switch to conservative. This is just a national trend, north, south, east, and west. So many shuls will go conservative that the JTS will not be able to produce enough rabbis for them. And that's why you have the famous post-war phenomenon of the person who is a musmach from an Orthodox yeshiva who becomes a rabbi in a conservative shul. It's something that many of us all grew up with and remember very well. Here's the guy Litvin, who maybe if anybody's old enough to remember, he's the only guy who took his shul to court and actually won, I think in Michigan somewhere, to prevent him from switching to conservative and all that, and became hero to the Orthodox and bane of them. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Leslie Silver, being the big Orthodox rabbis, testified in about a dozen cases in courts all across the United States, in New Orleans, in Cincinnati, and in all kind of different in Louisville, and in all kind of different places where in the years 45 to 55 to 60 or so, many times, there's the classic scenarios like this. There's a shul which was created, I don't know, 50 years before that, by Eastern European Jews. And the shul says in its charter, it's an Orthodox shul. And now there's a movement after the Second World War, 1945, 55, whatever, that they want to switch to conservative. They want to have mixed seating, they want to have this, they want to change the rabbi and all the rest of it. And a minority of the shul, usually by that time a small minority, says, no, it's against the Constitution. And the majority says, no, this is Orthodox and we can do it. And the minority takes them to court. And then the judges who don't like to do this have to get involved in what's exactly the definition of Orthodox. And the two sides go after each other, and each one pulls in rabbis to support their point of view. One of the most famous or notorious rabbis who testified all across the United States that mixed seating is perfectly compatible with Orthodoxy, and this is and that is Rabbi Agus from the Chizuk Emunah. I'm saying it wrong, from Bethel, right? You all remember. And he had smicha from YU, right? And he wasn't Talmud Chacham, by the way. So therefore he had the credentials to testify in all these courts. Against him, used to go Rabbi Soloveitchik, flew everywhere. Eliezer Silver, there are even funny stories about it, but I don't have the time to go into that right now to say it in there. And 9 out of 10 times they lost. In other words, the conservative won. There's a rare case where the conservative lost, but then they just seceded and made their own shul. What is going on over here? There's obviously, this was the conservative moment. This was a feeling for masses all across the United States that it's what I call the Goldilocks effect. The Orthodox is too much this way, and the Reform is that way, and conservative is just right. Right? Because, but it's true, right? The strictly Orthodox is too much. But Reform, that's too treif. What's a conservative, especially over there? It's traditional. To keep up many of the things. They're also very accommodating, for people's basic needs. And it's ideal. And it obviously, I'm speaking sociologically now, and it obviously responded to an unexpressed feeling all across the United States, the masses of American Jewry, that this is what the new generation felt very comfortable with. The face of conservative Judaism in this era is Louis Finkelstein, the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who Time magazine put on the cover. It's inconceivable in American culture that a rabbi would go on the cover of Time magazine. This is in other words, those who know, this is a cultural landmark itself. And Time magazine was trying to do an article about religion, about Jewish religion also, Catholic, Protestant, and Reform, and Jewish. The famous book of 1950 by Will Herberg is called Catholic, Protestant, Jew. And they argued at that time, and this was the universal consensus, that America has 3 religions. Islam didn't exist. The Buddhists were out nowhere. There are 3 religions in America. 3 religions: Catholic, Protestant, Jew. Now, obviously, the Catholic and Protestant is tens of millions. The Jew is this much. But it's after World War II. It's a new definition of political correct, as you just saw in the Gregory Peck movie. Everybody's trying to be good about this. We don't want to have anything, a suggestion of fascism, so it's going to be all 3. Which is going to be the 3? Are they going to show the Orthodox? No, it's too much. They're going to show the Reform? It's a little too much that way. And Finkelstein and the conservative, this is just right. And he was a weird guy. He spent all during World War II totally tuning out the Holocaust and arguing, making big plans to have the Jewish Theological Seminary become a university, which he imagined would be a meeting ground for minds around the world, that they would come up with universal peace. I mean, it's a strange story over there. And he spent the years afterwards here giving award to Martin Luther King, meaning trying to get involved to present the image of the Jewish Theological Seminary as the Jewish Theological Seminary, the one that really represents American Jewry, and trying to ignore the other elements in there. But they had their moment. And if you lived in 1950, for example, or even 1960, one shul after another is still switching. They obviously weren't to a winning ticket as they saw it over there. So you can't argue with the fact that conservative Judaism was in tune with with a very large segment of American Jewry. And the claim was, and this was considered a cogent claim, at least by the masses, conservative Judaism was making the claim to be the logical evolution of traditionalism. You understand? In other words, forget Orthodox. There's just always been traditional Judaism, which followed the halakha, as we do now, he says. The halakha has always changed somewhat, which is true. And so now we're changing to match the American system, the American reality. All the old shuls aren't really being untrue to themselves when they become considered. They're just modifying to fit the new American reality. And this sold very well, this kind of argument over there. The conservative movement, Jewish Theological Seminary, started for the first time ever in America a TV show, a radio show, magazines, the lamp at my feet. They got into Neo-Hasidism, which swept the American Jewish elites in the late 40s and early 50s. The teachings of Abraham Joshua Heschel and Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, you have Camp Ramah. They did a lot of things during those years. This was their moment. And yet, it is precisely at this moment that the conservative movement decided to go off the deep end to the left and start permitting driving on Shabbos in 1947. There's Rabbi Agus from Baltimore, he wrote the tshuva for them, the responsum, which tells you that driving a car is not really involved with fire, which means that instead they did something which was strategically, at least it seems in retrospect, strategically a mistake. Instead of coming up with no ideology whatsoever and just concentrating on the Goldilocks thing and getting more and more people, they decided to make a lurch to the left, which eventually became defining to them, because then 20 years later you have women rabbis, and 20 years later you have gay marriages, and 20 years later you have who knows what. And in doing so, they eventually came to alienate. The image that they had of a jelly was a very successful one. When they started tampering with that and actually coming out formally and changing the halakha, then they sort of really laid the grounds for undermining themselves in the long run. The triumph of the left at the Jewish Theological Seminary in the moment does occur in the post-war period. If you know anything about the history of conservative Judaism, prior to the Second World War, there was always a big fight in the movement between the right and the left. And people at the seminary who were traditionalists, like Louis Ginsburg or Professor Talmud and people like that, always said, don't change anything. If people want to drive, let them drive, but don't say it's okay. Don't play around with kashrus all day. Just let people do what they want to do, but don't formally do it. And then you have people on the left, like, Mordechai Kaplan, others say, no, we should reconstruct, right? Those, change the Shulchan Aruch and rewrite it. Actually, he rewrites the Siddur and the Haggadah and I don't know what else. And yet, the successor, Saul Lieberman, who was a frum guy, is always saying, no, don't do that. Just let the people do what they want, but don't give it a religious sanction. And these battles are happening, but he wins, and he doesn't. Okay? As long as he's alive, he kind of retards the process of the left-wing push. But it's, unstoppable. So, 1949 to 52 was a conservative summer. But it's not a theological statement on the part of the masses. It's a sociological statement. It's not everybody in America all of a sudden started to become enamored with the teachings of Mordechai Kaplan or something. And nobody read books in those days on religious subjects. It's not what most American Jews do. They do so for a wide variety of sociological reasons. And my favorite story from this period, which I think I've told before, is a book I read some time ago. A guy gave me about Charleston, South Carolina, which also had two, I think if I remember correctly, two Orthodox shuls, Eastern European, and then they were chugging along. Very few people that were actually Shomer Shabbos, but it was the Orthodox shuls. And then comes the end of World War II, and the late 40s comes the push, as comes everywhere else to go conservative, and this shul has its big meeting, the meeting. And at the meeting, you have 4 speakers from this side and 4 speakers from this side among the membership, because it's divided membership. And these are arguing that the shul should go conservative. These are arguing the shul should stay Orthodox. Happened all across America. Happened to Chizuk Amunah in Baltimore. Happened all over the place. And at this particular shul, these guys give their speeches, and then the 4 guys arguing for the Orthodox give their speeches. The first guy gets up and says something along the lines, how can you change the Torah and all this kind of stuff? And that goes flat. And the next guy gets up and says something along the lines, our ancestors, our grandparents started this as an Orthodox shul, how can we be untrue to their memory? And that goes flat, and so on and so forth. And the last speaker, the story was this little pants presser who gets up there and says, now you watch me. If you're going to go conservative, you're going to have a lady president. And they voted it down. They stayed Orthodox. So it's more a matter of sociology and things like culture than it's a matter of theology. That's what it seems anyway. More importantly, More importantly, conservative Judaism will embrace vapidity and it'll embrace inadequate education. And it'll embrace a fading cultural Zionism, which will cause its pretensions to vanish over the course of the late 20th century. The last 30 years, as I'm sure most of you seem intelligent. So he says, you follow the news. The conservatives lost 1/3 since 1990. Okay, there probably are people here in the audience that are examples of this. They had it, they blew it. Right? Ultimately, they blew it because they're okay with the status quo and this cultural wasteland that I'm talking about. And, as Abraham Lincoln said, you can't fool everybody all the time. Traditionalism in America at this time is in an advanced state of decay. All across the country, there's the phenomenon of the empty shul and no youth. I'm talking about the late 40s, early 50s. Right? The shul that we remember, many of us, from our youth. Okay? Everybody there is this age and older. There's very few people younger in there. Traditionalism, I don't want to call it Orthodox. It is, of course, Orthodox, but it's the Orthodox of long ago, which very few people are actually observant or fully observant, maybe the right words is. You still have the Yiddish culture that they brought up from the old world, but it's also an empty shell, simply because they failed. The grand failure of traditionalism in America, as is elsewhere, was to use a simple, vulgar term, no day schools. I mean, put it in simple terms, right? No, their neglect of Jewish education, intensive Jewish education. So naturally, the kids all just drift away. This is pervasive all across the United States. The conservative movement is trying to pick up those pieces, actually. But there are many like them all across America. And where are they going to go now that World War II is over? And really, the older generation is getting older and older and older and dying out. One solution that had already begun prior to the Second World War, which picks up steam particularly in the late 40s and early 50s, is modern orthodoxy, as the term was defined in those years. Okay? Doesn't mean the same thing today. I have to tell you, last year, some of you were I think, with me, Elena Kagan. Remember that? She was at Beth Tfilah with Rabbi Wilberg. And I'm sure many people saw it. She's a Supreme Court justice. And I think she comes from New York, and she knows the Orthodox conservative. And she said, in Beth Tfilah, she says, I was surprised to see there's such a big parking lot over here and all this. I thought this was a modern Orthodox shul. And that's a cultural marker, because she's defining modern Orthodox like Avi Weiss or something like that. You understand? Meaning, in New York terms, in which people are Shomer Shabbat, they're just modern in this way or that way. And Rabbi Wahlberg had to say, well, no, we mean modern Orthodox circa 1950, And, but terms change, don't they? 50 years ago, if you told somebody he was gay, it would mean one thing. If you say today it means something, the language changes. And so, the post-war years, in many respects, will be the golden years of modern Orthodoxy. I'm talking about so many of the shuls that once dotted Baltimore and elsewhere and no longer exist. It's less than ideology, which it is currently, but rather at that time was more an attempt to compete with the rise and expanding conservative Judaism. To put it in simple and vulgar terms, better a lo mechitza than no mechitza. That's the idea. And this had traction not only in Baltimore, but all across North America. It's again the model of a certain type of shul in which you're trying, and they did successfully, and if this is how you define your goal, you're trying to compete with the conservative synagogue. There is a chazan, there is decorum, there is this, you have the ushers, all the rest of it, you have an organized synagogue, you have the brotherhood, you have the whole 9 yards over there, you have an active life, and they did. Many traditionalists will go to modern Orthodox in the late 40s and early 50s. Many new Orthodox shuls will be founded along these lines. I repeat, many new Orthodox synagogues will be founded in the late 40s and 50s, all across America. Not conservative shuls, Orthodox shuls. I think including this one. They will appeal to a younger element, but they will not be Shomer Shabbos. They will not, for the most part, go to day schools. And so the whole thing will be a 30-year failure. Most of these shuls will have a 30 or 40-year lifespan. By the late 70s, these shuls will be in decline and crisis, as the youth will not join. But in its heyday, right, in the 40s and 50s, the world of synagogue dances, bowling leagues, and similar groups will provide an active synagogue life for members where they will socialize with fellow Jews. I'm sure many of us remember this. Right? This was all across North America. A more serious side of modern Orthodoxy will emerge in these years, concentrated in YU, Yeshiva University. Indeed, the years 49-52 will be the years of growth and expansion for YU. Stern College, for example, will open in 54. These schools, in other words, YU's set of schools, will be the bastion of serious modern Orthodox Jews, but the main focus there is Dr. Belkin, who became the president of YU after Dr. Revel, and was there for many years. Some remember him. Here's him with Albert Einstein. What are they doing? He's getting reshus from Einstein to call it the Albert Einstein Medical School. Tremendous progress, and it is, for Yeshiva University, but on the other hand, is a medical school a Judaic statement? Does that enforce or reinforce Judaism in America? It's a tricky question I'm raising over here. The strange era of Dr. Belkin, actually. He was an able administrator, but he was certainly not a charismatic leader. Right? He didn't inspire the American Jews or anything like this, as Rabbi Revel had. Okay? YU, during these years, will take off as an institution. And really, it becomes a university in 1945, and then it adds the medical school and other things in the early 50s. But it will not be seen as dynamic. It does not capture the passionate attachment of the youth of America. And that's what its original goal was. Not simply to be a professional school. That's very important too, I'm not knocking that. But it doesn't grab the emotional passion of the masses of American Jewish youth. These are late 40s and early 50s. The glory years are Rabbi Soloveitchik, Yeshiva Ber Soloveitchik. These are the years when his influence, I would say, was at its peak. Now, Rabbi Soloveitchik is an interesting person. He doesn't lead a movement, but he acts as an ideal figure. In fact, he would even use that term because it's a philosophical, sociological term. Again, to put it in simple terms, he doesn't start his own yeshiva and try to mold guys in his own image and send them across America to missionize and do like the Lubavitch or something like that. But rather, he teaches in an existing institution where his brilliance shines, but he has pervasive influence, but it's not directed to any goal of institution building. All right? It's a mitzvah tans. To my mind, it's also a certain lost opportunity. He had a chance in the late 40s and 50s. People looked at him and said, oh, so amazing. And he was an amazing person, and he didn't run with the ball. For the Haredim, as they're going to be called, the 40s and early 50s are dramatic years of revival. They're not years of revival. They never had a revival in the first place. It makes it a revival, right? Years of revival. The 40s are the years of the arrival of charismatic Gedolim during the war. Men had learned in Europe the hedgehog rule. You know, who was Archelaus said it long ago, the fox knows many things and the hedgehog knows one great thing. And so these guys, when they come to America, having survived the Second World War, it's chinuch, institution building, and nothing else. They got time for anything else. Right? So they don't know many things. They know one thing. A few examples. Who comes here in the 40s? Well, the Lubavitch Rebbe shows up, the Frierdiker Rebbe, and from day one, you got a hand to him. From day one, he said, I guess, start schools, start yeshivas and all this, and forget everything else. And he was right. And look what they've done. The Satmar Rebbe shows up, the Kleisenberg Rebbe. Also, the Hasidic, when they come over here, as soon as the war's over, rebuild. Start your own community, forget everything else. Gather together people, make a kehillah, start schools, start yeshivas, girls' things, and all the rest of it. In other words, they concentrate, like the hedgehog, on establishing institutions of self-perpetuation, which, interestingly, is something no other group in America is doing. You know, it's a little bit like when you read these stories about Steve Jobs and what was the other guy, Bill Gates. The IBM just didn't get it. You see, they're so big and they didn't get it. And these guys get it, and the rest of American Jewry is not even competing with them. They have limited constituencies, of course. You look at the Satmar Rebbe, for example. But American Jewry will not be the same afterwards. Think about it. Prior to the Second World War, America was, how should I put it? All the Hasidim lived by voluntarily. They all lived in Eastern Europe and Central Europe. That is where Hasidism located itself historically ever since the time of Baal Shem Tov. They did not want to move. Even after the First World War, they did not want to move. So they did not come to America. So obviously an American Jewry of several million with the absence of any kind of significant Hasidic leader is going to be enormously different than America in which you have some of the big shots showing up in this country and starting to exert influence. Do you get what I'm saying? The formative years of American Jewry, one in which there was a complete absence of any kind of dynamic Hasidic leadership. As somebody put it once, there were no kings and queens. They just had a couple of dukes and lieutenants. You know, the people who came to be rebbes in America prior to the Second World War, for the most part, you know, little operations. They didn't have much influence. These guys are going to have Lubavitch. I mean, to take an example, that's going to be a worldwide impact. And these are the leading Hasidic rebbes of the world. And due to the circumstances, they end up locating in the United States of America. American Jewry will be profoundly, it will not be the same afterwards. And of course, what affects the non-Hasidic Jewry, right, is of course the Baron Kotler, or people like that. He's probably the most influential, of course. And the reason is several-fold. In the mid-1940s, not long after he comes to America, with the Holocaust going on, he and Rabbi Mendelovitz from the Torah Daas really crystallized opinion, at least among a few, around the idea of the day schools. And they started the Torah Masorah, I think, in 1943. Once they start this, they run with this ball as hard as they can. The years 49 to 52, 40 to 52 are precisely the heroic years of Torah Masorah, when Dr. Joe Kamenetsky, I couldn't find a better picture, as he did for the next 20, 30 years, constantly crisscrossed North America, did he not? And it's a very interesting story as far as American Jewry is concerned, because they were in an advanced state of decayed traditionalism at the most. And he goes from the East Coast to the West Coast and the North and the South, you know, a place like Memphis and Atlanta, you know, all these off the wall, and Minneapolis and here and there and the other, not just New York and Chicago. And you go town after town, and you get together whoever you can. Exactly during these years, they say, we're going to start a day school, elementary school. And obviously there's opposition to it at the local level, but somehow they put it together. It's really the proper history of this particular phenomenon has not yet been written, as far as I'm concerned. You understand? It's a heck of a story from the point of view of American Jewish history. And particularly taking place, as I say before, not in 1908, but 1948. You see? It's you know, where do you get the few people left that want to do a day school? I would remind you, in the years I'm talking about, public school still worked. Right? Public school still worked. The desegregation of the schools, which is going to make such a vast revolutionary sociological difference all across the United States, has not taken place yet. In the years of 48 to 52, it's still legal segregation. Public school is free. Public school has quality. Why should you send your kid to a Jewish elementary school? But they do. That's the fascinating story over there. So that's one side of it, that Rabban Kotler and people like that will launch a movement to start Orthodox day schools, as they call them. That's a term they came up with during these years, all across the United States, which is going to have a vast impact, although I don't want to overemphasize it. And the reason I say I don't want to overemphasize it is that there's one big limitation of the Torah Masorah, and that is no high schools, or hardly any. And the years I'm talking about, and for a long time afterwards, and even today, to be perfectly honest, you have elementary schools all over the place, the 6th grade or 8th grade. There's very few high schools. That's why TA in Baltimore was unusual, because they were able, after many, many years, to get a high school going in 1943 and graduate a class in 47. And that's why we used to get boys from all over the world, literally, to come to, because there weren't that many high schools across the country. So these are not years for that necessarily. The high schools are going to be in New York and Chicago, and I think in Baltimore. I believe that's it. Maybe it's one or two other places. But that's later. That's later. So anyway, these are signs of real growth that you aren't finding in the other sectors of American Judaism, even though they're much larger and they have a much more impressive external aspect to them. In addition to that, in the late 40s, early 50s, we know, already in the 40s, Rabban Kotler starts Lakewood, which establishes a yeshiva in America which gains unprecedented charisma and which requires a cachet in the eyes of the public, similar to that of the great Lithuanian yeshivas in pre-war Europe, which had not happened in America prior to that. I know you started near Israel and Baltimore and this one over here and all the rest. I'm well aware of that. But they never got, what's the right word, nuclear, right? Until Lakewood and places come along, and all of a sudden, there's a culture, I'm talking about culture changes. There's a cultural change. It didn't happen overnight, obviously. But it does happen, in which, just as happened in Eastern Europe, all these Jews said, oh, you have Volozhin and you have Telz and this, even though they had no idea what's going on in there. But nevertheless, somehow or other, this charisma gets out. Similarly, this will happen in Lakewood, right or wrong, but that's a revolutionary change in mid-20th century American culture. And obviously, in the period I'm talking about, late 40s, early 50s, Lakewood is still very small, but it's going to grow, and it's growing unmistakably. And interestingly, Rabbi Cutler lays down a cultural marker of vast significance: no college, which was truly revolutionary. This establishes him and his followers as truly revolutionary, countercultural, and demonic in the sociological sense of the term. It means they want to wreck everything. Just the sort of appeal, I repeat, revolutionary, cultural, and demonic, which is just the sort of a thing to appeal to youth who are out to carve their own separate reality from the bourgeois world of their parents. Ironically, for a small but growing segment of the youth, the call away from the bourgeois lifestyle with a studied contempt for the Philistine middle-class values, principled rejection of Western civilization taught in college, and particularly principled rejection of liberal arts, replaces the former socialism and other revolutionary movements that have flourished among the youth in the past. After all, what was the big tug? What was the big attraction for so many in the 100 years ago, let's say, of the youth, towards all these different isms? Is there a total rejection of their parents' world? Why do you want to do that? That's what youth often does. They have to make their own world. I don't want to relive your life. We're all parents. It's a natural thing that you try your best to make your kids sort of, not exactly, but sort of relive your life. Sort of. And sometimes it works. And sometimes the kids find that stultifying. And so, that's not what we want to do. And here you have someone who said like this: the heck with college, the heck with this, the heck with all the rest of it, and all the... It touches a button. Anti-college will spread throughout the yeshiva world. It'll become a defining feature. I mean, the Telzer Yeshiva, for example, will pick it up in Cleveland and others. I mean, it really will become one of the key and very interesting features. I'm talking about strictly from a historical and sociological point of view right now of the yeshiva phenomenon, which grows after in 48, 52. And people are astonished, especially middle-class parents are astonished. Why do I have kids? Why does anybody want to go to a place in which they're going to get no education whatsoever? How are they going to make a living when they grow up, et cetera, et cetera? I know all that. And yet, in spite of all this, it's more and more and more and more. Okay? Obviously, this is going to delegitimate Yeshiva University. And particularly, the whole notion of Torah Mata. It's a principled, mind you, it's a principled rejection of the notion of Torah Mata. Isn't it? Okay? One would think, in a place like the United States of America, it wouldn't get too much traction. It would be a marginal phenomenon. And yet, we all know, particularly everybody's here tonight, that it's going to go the other way. You have the funny situation of Rabbi Soloveitchik during these years, in which everybody knows there's a Soloveitchik, there's a Ron Cutler at a famous dinner, in which everybody knows he's this great genius, and he was, and a great Gaon, without question. And yet, he's in the school of college, what's with him with the PhD, that whole phenomenon did not exist prior to the Second World War. Prior to 1945, I might even say. Okay? And so his position is going to be highly, what's the right word, problematized by the rise of this other sort of dynamic. Let's put it this way. He's going to get a lot more traction than he does. And then you have even the funnier situation, since we all live in Baltimore near Israel. Okay? In which the years 48 to 52 is exactly the years that Near Israel gets the formal accreditation for college. That's the Rosh Hashanah Rabbi Ruderman around 1940 or so. So I guess I couldn't find the picture of Rabbi Weinberg in those days. He didn't have a beard at that time. But remember, I just got back from Israel, so I don't have time to put this together right. But I can tell you right now, I think it was 50, 51, something like that, 52, that the yeshiva got its accreditation thanks to the famous, let's go to the next one, Professor William Albright, who was the big deal at Johns Hopkins, and I would say probably one of the two most or three most famous archaeologists of the 20th century, properly so. I actually teach in this class sometimes. And this is going the wrong way. I mean, what's near Israel going and getting college credits at a time where the definition of a real yeshiva is one when you, in principle, reject any connection with college. And yet Rabbi Ruderman held his ground. He felt, this is right. I remember reading, if you look in the book, what's it called, from Kamenetsky, Gadol, Making of a Gadol. I think he has there tucked away in one of the footnotes, which the whole book is footnotes. Then around, and I think it was 1952, some guys want to make a protest from New York and Lakewood and bring whole buses down to go to Forest Park and picket near Israel because they insist on making a deal with Loyola. And they all get together as a blizzard, right? But you know, it's like the classic story of the rabbi gets the hole-in-one on Yom Kippur. Who are you going to tell? You see? These are tensions which characterize, now listen closely to what I'm saying, these are tensions which characterized growth pains. And growth pains involve growth, right? You don't have these kind of tensions in the conservative reform and all the other movements. And that's actually a bad sign because there's nothing dynamic going in there. What they're doing is, as I said before, they're having a very well-organized, centralized, exterior or directed kind of movement. But growing pains indicate growth. Arguments such as this are there. What we can see by 48 to 52 is that the yeshivas that I'm talking about have an unexpectedly successful appeal to youth. Very small in the beginning, but which grow, as we all know, as the 50s, 60s, and 70s will go on. Post-war America sees an outburst of material prosperity, but it also engenders an ennui on the part of sensitive youth, which will explode in the 60s, will they not? In the decade of the dissatisfied but directionless American Jewish youth and American youth in general. Here's a classic picture. That's Woodstock. If you don't know what that is, don't ask. The fact, I mean, you weren't even a. Yeah. The point. No, seriously. Seriously, what is the '60s? What is all this about? It was about the fact that they had no way. The young did not like this bourgeois, highly materialistic. It's what you and I strive for, to put a buck on to bring bread on the table. That's how the parents saw it. But then, like this whole notion of what seems a world lacking in genuine idealism, and focused entirely on the materialistic side. But this youth had no way of expressing itself except by going for all kind of crazy things. My point in all this is that the post-war America produces the great materialism, but it also engenders eventually a reaction against the materialism. Now, you might argue that it's a stretch to compare this with Lakewood, but you would be wrong. Because, no, you understand what I'm saying. They both involve a rejection, except one's done in one way and one's done in another. But the fact that it pervades the entire society, in fact, not only in the United States, but in Europe as well, the fact that society shows you we're dealing with vast, cultural, deep issues of tremendous significance that the participants themselves probably weren't aware of that they were acting in. Okay? I'm talking about a tiny niche, obviously. How many people end up going to yeshivas or day schools. But it's a very important niche because it'll grow, and it's still in the process of growing. None of this that I'm speaking about, especially in the 40s and 50s, is noticed by the American Jewish establishment. Charles Liebman, the famous sociologist, doesn't write his seminal work in which he calls attention to this, to the educated American elite readers until 1964 or something like that, right? Where he said, guess what? This is going on all around you. It's almost legendary today that the New York Times is shocked. It's a famous story. New York Times is shocked when Ron Cutler dies in 62, I think. They get 100,000, I don't know, but, tens of thousands of people show up at the thing, and they say, who the heck is this guy? Right? Because there's still a Gregory Peck. You understand? In other words, they're viewing the world through their glasses, just as the parents of Woodstock viewed the world through their glasses and didn't really understand. They thought they knew what's going on upstairs in their children, but they didn't. So in the same way, it's this funny, era. And thus, although conservative Judaism was in its summer, but it was a summer to be followed by autumn and winter. Orthodox Judaism was in the spring to be followed by a summer. Now, is the Orthodox summer destined to be followed by autumn? That's the question of all questions. That has to do with this stuff over here, does it not? I can tell you what happened in the past. We can only speculate about the future. Good night.